Now turning back to Louisville, where the Metro City Council is continuing its investigation into both Mayor Greg Fischer and the Metro Police. Last night, the council met to give updates and hold votes on how to move forward. This comes the same day Mayor Fischer expressed frustration over the pace of probe into Taylor's death. Darcy Costello is joining us now from Louisville with updates. She is one of several reporters at the Courier-Journal following the Breonna Taylor case. Darcy, thanks for joining us. Let's start with this Metro Council meeting last night. Did we learn any new information? And can you tell us a little bit more about Mayor Fischer's announcement involving the state police?
Yes, sure. Actually, last night's Metro Council meeting was pretty quick. They didn't do too much related directly to Breonna Taylor's case. They did approve the language for an oath for people to come testify in their investigation into Mayor Fischer's handling of the case, among some other things. And they do have a lot of pending legislation with regard to this Breonna Taylor case. They're looking at mandating drug and alcohol tests after officer-involved shootings, and they have a resolution calling for greater transparency into police investigations. But those have been held up a bit in committee, so they didn't get voted on last night. But as you said, that's not to say that changes aren't still happening in city government related to her case. Yesterday, Mayor Greg Fischer announced that he would ask Kentucky State Police to investigate future officer-involved shootings. As it is now, and as it was done for Breonna Taylor's case, it was investigated by LMPD's internal public integrity unit, and they handle investigations of all criminal activity, suspected criminal activity by Metro government employees. So that's a pretty big shift. KSP investigates a lot of other officer shootings throughout the state for police departments, but up until this point, LMPD had been doing those investigations itself.
So Mayor Greg has actually expressed some frustration about how long this investigation is taking. He thinks it shouldn't be taking as long, but he's not blaming police for that. Who does he blame for the holdup? And you know, what is the reason that it's taking so long?
Right. Yesterday, he said in a speech that was posted online that he's, quote, incredibly frustrated with the pace of the investigation. And he's referring specifically to Attorney General Daniel Cameron's independent investigation. The LMPD investigation was turned over to Cameron's office on May 20th, in addition to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, which has since stepped back from the investigation. But Mayor Fischer's point is, you know, we turned this over. It was substantially complete. I gave it to you on May 20th because I wanted this case to move forward. He says he's as anxious as the rest of the city to get Cameron's decision on charges for the officers so that the city can begin to move forward. But I'll note in those remarks, in that position that he's taking, he's kind of omitting the piece of protester and onlooker concerns about the officers that are still employed with the department. So he's saying, you know, I really want to get this case wrapped up with. A piece of that in protesters' minds would be firing the remaining 2 officers who have been administratively reassigned. And that is in Fischer's and LMPD's purview to do. So I just wanted to note that too.
I'm really intrigued by this lawsuit. The Courier-Journal is currently suing government officials over calls held between the mayor and the Metro Council. Who is investigating the mayor's role before and after Taylor's death? Are these calls a conflict of interest? What is the paper hoping to uncover here?
Sure. So we originally filed a complaint alleging that there was an open meetings violation between the Metro Council and the mayor's office when they were having these calls. We know they began as like twice weekly check-ins about the city's response to COVID. And then as protests swarmed downtown streets, they shifted to kind of talk about the administration's response to those protests and flesh out council members' concerns. In an open records request, we got some of the original emails back and forth that were setting up these calls, and in one of them, Fischer requests the calls and pitches them as an opportunity to, quote, discuss strategy and provide an opportunity to ask questions. And so the Courier-Journal's position is that the public should be able to know what its decision makers are talking about and have access to those meetings, which we consider to be open meetings. The city had said that no public business was discussed because they weren't discussing matters that were pending quick votes So it wasn't talking about specific legislation, for example, but our attorney's position is they could be talking about the weather, they could be talking about baseball coming back, but the second they talked about city business, that's a public meeting that we should have access to. And part of those requirements would be taking minutes, advertising the date and time of the meeting, and allowing the public to hear what's being discussed.
So the LMPD is saying, look, the release of any documents related to this case, that's going to have an impact on the ability for an impartial investigation to be conducted. What are Breonna Taylor's lawyers saying? Because I'm sure that they would love some of this documentation to be released to the public.
Sure. Yeah. So that the latest response from LMPD regarding those documents is actually in response to a separate Courier-Journal lawsuit. We sued to get access to the full investigative file for Breonna Taylor's case the day that it was turned over to the Attorney General, arguing that final action had been taken, LMPD had passed it on to someone else, so we should have access to it. And I'll note that since then, Officer Brett Hankinson was terminated from the department based on the contents of this investigative file. So our attorney's position is that it should be released because final action was taken on his employment status. He is appealing that decision. But in a court filing from LMPD this week, they said that releasing these records would harm the integrity of the investigation, and said that the news media wants to monitor criminal investigations in real time, and said, quote, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's impossible to put it back in. Our attorney's position on that is, the newspaper's role is to find the facts, and the administration is trying to avoid that in not releasing these documents. You asked about Breonna Taylor's attorney's position on this. I think that he is Sam Aguiar, the one that's the local Louisville representation for Taylor's family, has argued that there are some documents that would not harm the integrity of the investigation that could be released. One example I think that he might give is any body camera from that night, or potentially radio transmissions. We've appealed for the radio transmissions from that night. But yeah, I think he would argue that there are some that could be released.
Darcy, let me ask you about several NBA players who decided to dedicate their performance and their post-game interviews to Breonna Taylor, including LeBron James and Chris Paul. Several other players, as you know, are using their time to speak on her death. What do players and protesters want to see happen next? Are you seeing any kind of, are you seeing that the pressure from multiple voices demanding justice for Breonna Taylor having any effect on officials there in Louisville?
I think it's really interesting to see how this has become a national conversation. You saw a giant mural being painted in Maryland. I believe the WNBA is wearing her name on the back of their jerseys. And as you said, some NBA players have been speaking out. I think it was Tobias Harris this week who said he was going to answer every question in the press conference, with emphasizing that he wants Daniel Cameron to arrest the officers involved in Breonna Taylor's death. And as you said, LeBron James wore her name on his shoes, and in a recent interview compared her case to George Floyd's and said, basically, is that what we need? Is a video of Breonna Taylor being killed for people to realize how bad the situation is? And interestingly, that is a comparison that Mayor Greg Fischer has made himself in explaining why the case is taking so long. There's no concrete documented video evidence of what took place, so it's a longer investigative process. So I think the national attention is definitely being felt here. You saw 87 protesters arrested at Daniel Cameron's house recently and charged with a felony before those charges were dismissed. And so a lot of them were from out of town, were celebrities, reality stars. So I think it's definitely being felt. It's hard to say if Daniel Cameron is changing any part of his investigation based on that. I don't think we have really reason to believe that's the case, but I definitely think he's aware of it. At a press conference, I believe it was in June, he acknowledged that Beyonce had sent him a letter. So I think people can feel it. I don't know that it making things move any quicker, though.
So really quickly, Louisville is preparing to be the site of a number of demonstrations and protests this weekend. One group in particular is planning on being fully armed. They're encouraging people who legally have the right to bear arms to come to Louisville to protest with their guns. Are you hearing anything from the city, from the police department, how they're kind of preparing for this?
Right. It's the NFAC, Black militia, that's planning to come. They recently made headlines in Georgia when they marched at a carving of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson. And I'll note that since they announced their intention to come on Saturday afternoon to Louisville, the 3%ers have also said they plan to have a presence and say they want to have, quote, boots on the ground. The NFAC estimated they would have 5,000 to 6,000 people. I don't know if that's an accurate estimate or not. And they were originally going to march from Central High School to Jefferson Square Park, which has been the site of ongoing protests for racial justice, but now they're marching from a different park to Jefferson Square Park. And police plan to separate these separate protest groups with bike barriers. They're closing down some streets and plan to have a presence to make sure that laws are followed.
All right, Darcy Costello, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.